to In the Margins. Today we have as our guest Dr. Wendi Williams, who is the new provost and senior vice president at Fielding Graduate University. Dr. Williams, thank you so much for joining us here on In the Margins. I'm excited about our conversation. I think it's going to touch on a number of pressing issues that our audience either is engaged in research about or dealing with on their campuses. And so, again, thank you so much for being with us. Welcome, Dr. Williams. And my first question for you is, could you talk about your own education journey and how you first got into psychology? What attracted you to the psychology field in the beginning?
Well, David, thank you first so much for having me and doing me the honor of having me in this space and on this platform with you. I'm really excited. I follow this publication and so feel kind of excited and a little imposter syndrome maybe around being invited to speak here, but I think it speaks to, the importance of the role and the importance of the publication in that way in terms of amplifying our voices and so that we're in this space. My educational journey starts first of many things. In my family, I was the first to attend Head Start, and I start there because I am an educator, I am a psychologist, and I do believe in the value and importance of a critical early childhood educational experience. I think that, something my brother would likely say is like, she went to Head Start and it's different with her. It's different with her. It was a program that was funded by the federal government and initiated with a number of experts in early childhood education across the nation to ensure that we gave Black and Brown and lower socioeconomic status children and families a head start. And so my educational journey begins there. It also is tethered to the fact, and that I'm very proud of, that I'm the first in my family to get a college education. So I'm a first generation college education student, and I'm really happy to share that, especially for those listening, to one, hold up and have pride if that's your story. And for young people coming through to not feel whatever shame or expectation they might have around that. It actually means a lot for us to be in these spaces. Actually, I think is what sort of shapes the way that I think about what it means to be an educator and an educational administrator and a psychologist. So I was drawn to the field and work of psychology because I had two main ideas. One idea centered around the experience of a healthy academic self-concept among Black children. So this is what inspired me to go to a doctoral program in the first place. I was really interested in how one's African-American and African-centered identity, or when I was in graduate school, we talked about it as Africanity, how it shaped and created a space of positive identification to support them in the educational space. This was a type of research and interest that I had sitting alongside and studying notable psychologists like Janet Helms, who developed the racial identity development scale and theory. And so sitting alongside and thinking about how one's psychology can be enhanced by having a healthy relationship with their racial identity was really important to me. And because I've always loved being a student and seeing the power and possibility in becoming educated, how one's racial identity can be seen as an asset was incredibly important to me. The other area of focus for me, and it's where I landed with my dissertation, when I was in graduate school, we had two projects, a pre-dissertation project and a dissertation project. So my pre-dissertation project focused on the one with college students, and my dissertation focused on the integration of racial and gendered identity for Black women, and to really understand how one's identity is shaped, especially given some of the common narratives that Black women had been, provided and given, that, you must choose race or gender, rather than really holding through and holding up the fact that those things are happening. Those identities are occurring and growing alongside one another within us. There certainly had been political conversations and sociological conversations, but in terms of psychological study, when I was a graduate student, many years ago, that was there. It didn't sit inside of the psychology canon. So that was my work.
It's interesting. As I was reading up on your background, I did notice that you have a particular emphasis on the experience of Black women and Black girls in particular.
Yeah.
And I was curious about, and you, of course, you mentioned very importantly that you are a first generation college graduate, and that's such a unique student subset when it comes to their needs. Of course, the difference between the first generation student and the student where their parents, grandparents, everybody went to college, everybody knows the deal. They may look the same, but their needs are so vastly different. And so it's just interesting that you have that background. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about both how your background researching and working with Black girls and women, and perhaps even your own personal background. You mentioned that you're a first generation student. How do those things inform what you do today?
Oh gosh, so directly. And I would say that it's my research, but it's also my practice. I'm a scholar practitioner. And so the questions that I pose and ask in my work are important to me because they're relevant to the society and the culture. And so when I was doing work with my initial focus and development of doing work with young people and with girls began out of an employment situation. While I was in my master's program at Pepperdine University in California, I also worked, which is a function of sometimes of being a first generation college student. You're not even aware of all the different types of funding that could support you and your academic studies so that you're not working so much and don't have the competition between those things, right? But I worked for a company, Big Brothers and Big Sisters of Greater Los Angeles. And it was in that space where I could see with boys and girls how important the mentorship relationships were that we were cultivating and nurturing with them. I ran a program at a middle school, so it's where I fell in love with. I love that age group with children. I know a lot of people run away from that age group with young people, but I absolutely adore all of it. And it's in that space where I realized that, they're coming into their sense of self and identity, and they need something solid to hold on to. And that the something solid to hold on to is something that's already there. We have to, I think, awaken and make it valuable and allow them to see the asset that is their cultural expression. As a woman, as a psychologist, as a Black woman who's a Black feminist psychologist, I understand and connect these elements of who I am with my professional and my political. And that all sort of sits inside of my research, but also my practice as a leader. I think that it's critically important to lead from an authentic space, to own all of who I am and to model that for others. It's incredibly important. I know that wherever I sit, people are looking at me and listening to me. And so it's so vital and critical that I advance. And so I will say it today, that the leader that I am and the person and the work that I do is the way that I'm supposed to do it. And you're supposed to do your work in the way that you're supposed to do it, because it's authenticity that matters most. I want that for all of us, but more than that, our communities need that, especially when we think about the types of leadership gaps we experience in our world and our society today. For me, I believe part of the challenge is that we are replicating old models or mimicking others rather than really grappling and growing out from an internal sense, an authentic sense of our own selves and how that manifests in a leadership space. I'm in the space of wondering whether or not I even answered your question, David. So you have to tell me.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I was just curious and interested in, of course, how your background informs what you're doing today. And that probably leads into my next question. When did you first become interested in higher education leadership? I was wondering if you could talk about you as scholar practitioner and when you became first interested in higher education leadership. I think you were dean of the School of Education, if I'm not mistaken, at Mills. Can you talk about the journey from scholar practitioner to higher ed administrator and how your background prepared you for that transition?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for making me not feel so bad for veering away from topic. Yeah, I think that being a scholar practitioner, being someone, there's the field of action research as well, where I think the scholar practitioner really can ground down in their sense and perspective of what the focus of the work is and should be, is that it should be relevant and it should make sense to the communities and the spaces in which you're practicing. It is not knowledge for knowledge's sake. It is knowledge for improving the lives of others and improving the conditions for all of us. So my background certainly has placed me in the position of seeing systems and structures and institutions that were not working in my favor, were not working with or for me. So it really puts me in a space of, well, what would it have looked like for it to work for me or to work for my friend here or then and there? Those situations where we might have, could have, and some of them did get, lost in the cracks. So my positionality helps me to understand where some of those cracks are. I will say that the cracks have shifted and they're different. I'm generationally older, and so where they were for me may or may not be where they are now, but I'm aware of the fact that we can have structural challenges and ways in which we've organized ourselves that unless they're organized from the start with the seed of equity, justice, and opportunity at the heart, they will leave people behind. And so really then to start from that place. So my background shapes me in that way. And I think that in terms of higher education leadership, I mark that as happening actually much earlier than my deanship at Mills College School of Education just a few years ago, to when I first decided to become or was asked in the counselor education program that I taught in at Long Island University in Brooklyn, which is a minority serving institution in Brooklyn, New York. And, I really was drawn to working with that group of students because, again, I resonated with the fact that many of them were first generation college students. Many of them needed and wanted to see a person who looked like them in front of them. But I was asked to be the program coordinator for the counseling programs that we were running there. And I said yes. And in doing so, I recognized, it's a bit more work, to organize and structure, create, systems, whatnot for students. But it was also one of the main ways that I could articulate a vision for justice and equity within the context of their educational experience, because we were able to create the structures for which our students could operate within. And in that way, shore up some of those cracks that typically happen in higher education. So I had the bug then. I am a systems thinker, but I'm also a puzzle solver. And so for me, those equity challenges exist inside of a type of puzzle to crack. I do believe that some of the ills of our society in terms of inequity are solvable. They're solvable by a transformative and a radical equity practice. And they're also solvable because what may seem out of sorts or so different from what we've done in the past, for some, that doesn't strike me in that way. For me, I see those practices or changes or policy maneuvers as ways that we close those cracks. And so it does, it just feels like, well, shouldn't we do that? If the question is, don't we want our students to be successful and to be here and to thrive and to be retained and finished, then we would make these types of changes for them. And so that's really what guides me. It, I think, gives me more courage in my leadership because that's my North Star, that the students are all right. So I'm not always very concerned about how what it is that we're doing will look, when I know that if it looks like students are finishing, that they're achieving their goals, that they're finishing within a reasonable amount of time, that they're leaving school with less debt than they would have in other ways. And, if we're really addressing those types of issues, then that looks good to me. And so that's what we will do.
Given what's happened with the pandemic over the last few years, one of the major, of course, issues when it comes to equity is this so-called digital divide. That's one issue that has come to the fore, and really the differences between the have and the have-nots. When it comes to things like internet access, when it came to things like study spaces when school is closed, right? So many students had the experience of, there was no dedicated space at home to study. They can't study and take care of the kids, of course, who are home. So many issues that came to the fore from an equity standpoint kind of affected higher ed enrollments across the board. And I was wondering if you could talk about Fielding's position when it comes to serving the unique needs of students, coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. Obviously, there's been much written and said about, the pandemic did not cause inequities. It helped to reveal them. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, from your vantage point at Fielding, how your current institution can and has responded to all of the inequities, I would say, that have been exposed by this pandemic?
One of the reasons why I chose Fielding is because of its history and its background around creating opportunities for educational access and opportunity for just those students. Fielding was founded and grounded in the perspective of what would it mean to provide quality, rigorous adult education. And at that time, that was defined at age 40 plus. What we're realizing now is that some of the types of adult challenges that in the mid 70s were part of the Fielding perspective and view of like where to target their attention are actually facing and shaping the life experience of so many of our Gen Zers and millennials right now. Thinking about being an adult learner means you are someone who likely has a job, has a family, has people who are dependent on you, maybe are sandwiched within a generation of caretaking responsibilities or financial provision responsibilities. So the idea of uprooting and relocating to a brick and mortar higher ed institutional opportunity, while one might have made the grades and achieved and secured these very scholarships, they actually couldn't wrap their life around that opportunity. So Fielding was so much a part of making that accessible. And I do think that that's a huge piece of what happens for communities, diverse communities, non-white communities, and I would say communities grappling with economic challenge and struggle, wherein you are, one is so relied upon in their home and their community setting that to leave would be a detriment. And so the grappling with home community investment and support and putting financial, human, love resources back in the family is so necessary. And actually to leave them, to take that away for 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, however long the doctoral degree, for example, can go as long as that, means that you miss a critical moment in the family's life that they may or may not survive, or may not do as well as they could had they had you there. The type of brain drain that can happen for communities is sometimes unacceptable, whether you are a person of African descent, a person coming from an indigenous community and space and background. We're doing some really wonderful work, for example, with Navajo Nation and doctoral programs in leadership. Same with some of our partnerships with HBCUs, and really thinking about minority serving institutions and Hispanic serving institutions, where this type of commitment and connection to collectivistic ideas around community and culture are so vital. And I would say too that there are many communities that, especially in light of the COVID pandemic, we realized our reliance on one another, and where many of us found safety and security was in the unit of the family, extended or otherwise, and or chosen family. So the idea of what is available for our students, that they can remain in their lives and still pursue the calling of their life, is so critical. And so they don't have to make such a stark choice. That's been the story of Fielding. And right now, what we're doing is really connecting that to this current moment, which has its own challenges and pressures, which are quite different. Adulting, as the kids call it now, is different in a lot of ways. It actually there's this way in which adolescence has been extended, but also the confrontation with real deep and challenging cultural and societal life crises are often and always happening. And so we're grappling with a group of individuals whose entire lives have actually been in some shape, form, or fashion crafted around political and environmental crises, race and racism crises, and also our country and our nations and our world's willingness, or global willingness, to name those forces as they are. That's a scary time for them. Psychologically, we know that they grapple with mental illness, or that they are at least naming that mental illness is a force in their lives, and needing more support and asking for that support, for which I'm grateful that our young people are. But it also means that the space of and the ways in which they're in their educational experiences is different too.
When it comes to your role at Fielding,
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you mentioned that, one of the opportunities, one of the things that attracted you about the institution is the way that they've responded historically to the needs of diverse populations.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could talk about some of the priorities that you may have set? I know that, of course, you are just getting settled into your new role, but what are some of the opportunities you see when it comes to your position and how you may be able to help move the ball forward on some of these important diversity issues that we're discussing?
You're right. It is new. We're still in the early days, but where I'm seeing some clear areas of growth and clear areas of putting effort and attention is in really thinking about how do we craft a student experience that centers health and wellness as well as academic achievement. We have always had a distributed learning model that's meant that our students are everywhere and that we also have key moments of coming together. This institution was one of the first to actually put an aspect of its academic programming online in 1984, if you can believe it, when the internet was just being born. You can imagine what kinds of hiccups and headaches that probably had for folks as they were trying to figure out that technology. But I say that to say that we've always been in the space of thinking of how the technology and how the access points to connection and relationship are made and support the experience for our students. And I think that what we're seeing now in the current moment is ways of articulating and advancing connection and community that are so different and in ways that perhaps higher ed just hadn't had to think about. Certainly when you are a typical brick and mortar institution, you think about the student commons. And I think as all of us went home for the pandemic, there was no student commons. So where is the space for students? Many of them went home and were isolated. Many of them found it very difficult to differentiate, particularly from the undergrad space, what being at home and being at school, the difference was because, you know, they didn't have that. I think for us, and for me especially, I'm particularly interested in what it means to cultivate a robust, wellness-oriented focus toward academic and educational achievement and professional development, and what it means to do that for full-grown adults. It's more than affinity groups in that space, right? And so what does that look like for them? Another element that I'm really excited about, and we're just in the early stages of this work, so I look forward to how it will manifest as we get more deeply inside of it, is the full integration of our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts and initiatives inside of the academic life and the intellectual life of the institution. For me, it's something that I often see a lot of language around this type of thing, but when you dig deep inside of the guts of an institution, it doesn't always look much different than a piecemeal class here, a seminar there. I really want us to access and grapple with what does it mean to, in many ways, shift the perspective and the orientation to our academic fields of study through prioritizing and positioning that lens, not centered out and away from or toward, communities of color, as you will, or diverse issues, but rather grounded out and facing out from those spaces. What does it look like to ask the questions about the work that we're doing from the positionality of the diversity of our students in our world and our society? That is a different orientation. And so you're right, I've been here for a little over a month, so not as much time has passed, but these are the questions that I'm asking. This is the push that I've initiated and that I've been involved with my colleagues around engaging. And so that's where we are. I think it drives a lot. It drives student experience, it drives academic policy, it drives so many of the nitty-gritty details, but it also drives larger vision and mission. And I think for me, those being the students, our students, and our connection and our commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice are critical.
In many ways, and you've already alluded to this, that fielding graduate university was better prepared than many institutions to respond to the challenges brought by the pandemic, right? So many institutions, of course, as you're well aware, had to on the fly develop, remote, hybrid modalities of instruction, and and the concern by many is that we lost a generation of some first generation students, for instance, who had to struggle just to come to the point of which they were ready to enter college, and then everything just gets shut down. And so there is a concern about the students, who might have been lost, shaken out of the entire higher ed pipeline amid, what we've seen with this pandemic. There are a number, of course, of individuals in our listening audience who are at institutions who struggled really to meet the needs of diverse learners amid what happened and what went on with this pandemic. And of course, you've already mentioned that when you are weighing your own career options, what Fielding has stood for and offers was attractive to you. And so I was wondering if you have a word of counsel to any of our listeners, who are at institutions who are trying to make a difference around some of these issues, but may lack, for instance, the resources or the technological capabilities or some of the things that Fielding historically has had in place to support diverse learners. I was wondering if you might have a word of counsel for any individuals in our audience who want to make a difference, right? Reaching these types of students, but may not know really where to begin because of the institutions that they are at, not necessarily having that orientation. So anything that you would say to those who want to make a difference, but not really seeing the resources when it comes to serving these diverse learners that we've been discussing?
It really is interesting for Fielding as an institution, to be quite honest, to be in this moment, because we are able to see elements and aspects of our model replicated and now being seen as best practices when historically they were seen as alternative, too far afield, not a part of the traditional canon. And so it is really quite phenomenal. And it speaks to, I think, a type of innovation that this institution continues to have the capacity to put forth. What I would say, and especially it's particularly in the under-resourced context where we really need to tune in, right? That's where our students, they're there because they feel an affinity for those spaces. They feel a connection to the mission, the values, the community that's created in those institutional spaces. And I think that we need to listen to them when they tell us what they need. And so I would say if there is one piece of advice, it's to cultivate an orientation of humility and ask the students what they need. There's so much information out there, and there's a lot that's likely generalizable to many different contexts and environments and situations. But your students know what their needs are and or would welcome the opportunity to be invited to respond to that question, to know that you care. You may not be able to deliver on every single thing that they need or want, but the idea that you are interested in trying to do so in the ways that you can matters so very much. It helps them to stay. Because oftentimes our students are in a predicament where they have to decide whether to go or leave, similar to like push and pull factors we see around transition and migratory movements as well. We need to create the pull factors for our students. And those are uniquely personal. Those are uniquely attached to their particular needs. And I think that each institution has a student profile for which they might begin to put some sort of protective covering around those students to provide them some of the things that they're needing. I would say to ask them. They really do know. And I would say not to make false promises either.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. My last question for you is with regards to, of course, there's been a focus on racial justice. Many people have given, they said, hey, we were really under a twin pandemic, right? Racial justice was one issue faced by diverse populations, as well as we already know that the COVID-19 pandemic was felt most acutely by those in diverse populations. And so my last question to you was with regards to the concern about race fatigue, right? Many who are working in DEI spaces say, this focus was good, but what can be anticipated is a period of race fatigue. That's a concern where a focus on DEI will not be as well received as it was maybe a year and a half ago when we saw the flashpoint really come to the fore. And so I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how higher ed leaders can continue momentum that we have seen over the last year, both in terms of the conversation and in terms of the resources that are invested and really tackling the issues faced by diverse learners. And so, my last question for you is how, in your position and others who are in your position, can continue the momentum on DEI issues, given the concern of race fatigue that many have that say, hey, haven't we done enough? How can you and how can those who are serving academic leadership positions in other institutions continue momentum on DEI issues, given the concern that at some point some will say, haven't we done enough?
I hear you. And, that is a common analysis, and it's true. I've seen it because this isn't the first time that we've had a microscope on the race relations of this country and over our world. I have my own rememberings of coming through college and high school when Rodney King was beaten, and we saw that when the Los Angeles riots. I grew up in Southern California, so there are these ways in which, yes, there's a flashpoint, there's a tension, and then there's a withdrawal. What I would say is that any large shift or change requires institutional shift and transformation. And so the business of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice needs to be the business of the institution, and therefore in my view, when it's inserted and integrated into the business functions of the institution, therefore you get, I think, more over time and more push and follow through. That's not just of the moment and responding to the initial emotional discomfort, cultural shock that comes of these moments, but rather how our student organizational system structure, how our financial aid system structure, what are our ways of communicating to our students, how are we organizing our courses, what are the structures and the criteria by which we're evaluating our students and our faculty and our staff, how have we embedded the principles and the rubrics of diversity, equity, and inclusion in all of those places, in our HR, in our technology. There actually is a place for all of it. And so I am not a proponent of seeing a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion as separate and away from the business of the institution. I think of it as engaging in matrix organizational structural shift and change, where then we see it everywhere. And therefore, in the same way that there is writing all across our curriculum, there is reading all across our processes, no matter where we are in our institution, we are also able to see or the uses of technology, for example, and various technologies. Diversity, equity, and inclusion should live across an institution in those ways as well. Then you don't have to worry about where it's going because it's everywhere.
Dr. Williams, thank you so much for spending some time with me here for In the Margins. Appreciated your insights. I believe our audience will as well. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate you.